The weight of the evening settles into your chest, much like a held breath finally and softly released. Slowly, the rush of your day fades into the distance, carrying its noise away with it. You are left in the quiet, damp morning air of rural Japan, long before the turn of the 17th century. The world is perfectly still. Leaning quietly against a weathered wooden doorframe, a heavy practice sword rests in the pale light. It is meant for a grown man, but it belongs to a 13-year-old boy named Shinman Musashi. Even at such a young age, he is already taller than the men around him, moving with a quiet heaviness that makes the village elders watch him with a gentle, unspoken unease. He picks up the wooden blade, feeling the rough, ancient grain of the wood against his palms. The hilt is far too large for a boy's grip, forcing his hands into a stiff, unfamiliar hold. He breathes in slowly. The cold morning air fills his lungs, while the sleepy village begins to stir in the background. Before the sun fully sets on this quiet place, he will stand on a dusty field and face a grown, fully trained swordsman. And while the village holds its collective breath, the young boy will win. Yet, there will be no loud triumph, and no rushed glory to disrupt the heavy peace of the afternoon. Instead, the memory of it all simply softens and fades away, leaving only the boy sitting alone in the cooling grass when the trial is finally over. He does not celebrate and he does not boast. He merely sits in the deepening shadows, watching the fine dust settle gently back onto the damp earth, while the distant hum of cicadas lulls the fields to sleep. The day softly closes its eyes around him, and everything grows beautifully, perfectly quiet. The afternoon slowly deepens into dusk, and the memory of that early triumph on the dusty field softly folds back into the quiet rhythm of the mountains. Before he was known to the world as a legend, the boy carried a different name, and he walked through a different, much smaller world. They called him Benusuke in those days, a child born into the mountainous isolation of Miyamoto province. The village was a quiet place, tucked away from the chaos of a country that was slowly tearing itself apart in the distance. The boy watched and said nothing. Here, the passage of time was measured only by the changing of the seasons and the gentle, rhythmic sway of the rice fields. The air was often heavy with the scent of damp earth and the fragrant smell of rice fields after a long, cooling rain. He was a boy who seemed to take up too much space in this fragile, quiet world. He moved slowly. Even as a young child, Benusuke possessed a physical heaviness that made the villagers glance at him with a quiet, unspoken unease. He was strong, far stronger than a boy his age had any right to be, and he carried a heavy, lingering temper that seemed to mirror the unpredictable summer storms that rolled over the mountains. People whispered that he was trouble, not the playful kind of trouble that villages easily forgive, but a quiet, dangerous kind of presence that unsettled the room when he entered. Yet beneath that imposing frame, there was a profound and lingering solitude. He was entirely alone. He would sit for hours on the edge of the wooden veranda, feeling the cool, polished wood beneath his bare feet, while listening to the distant hum of cicadas pulsing in the tall grass. The world around him was always moving, always shifting, and he merely observed its slow, steady rhythm. The afternoon was very warm. The house he grew up in was a place defined more by what was missing than by what was there. The records of his early life remained softly blurred by the passage of time, leaving only quiet fragments of his mother. Some say she passed away when the boy was barely 7 years old, while others whisper that she simply left the village, quietly slipping away into the fog of history. Either way, her absence left a heavy, hollow space in the wooden halls of his childhood home. The floor was always cold. He grew up without the soft, comforting presence that most children rely upon to temper the harshness of the world. Instead, he learned to find his comfort in the quiet isolation of the mountains, tracing the grain of the floorboards with his fingertips while the day gently faded. He closed his eyes. In the space left behind by his mother, there was only the towering, demanding presence of his father, Shinman Munisai. Munisai was a samurai of considerable skill, a master of the jutei, which was a heavy iron weapon designed to catch and effortlessly break the blades of rival swordsmen. He was a man shaped by the rigid, unforgiving world of martial discipline, and he brought that same cold rigidity into his home. Their relationship was not warmed by affection or easy laughter, but was instead forged in the brutal, echoing strikes of wooden practice weapons. The father demanded perfection. Munisai tried to teach his son the ancient arts of his ancestors, attempting to mold the boy's restless energy into something structured and refined. But the training was relentlessly harsh, leaving little room for the boy to simply be a child. He was forced to grow up. The young Benosuke was not the type of child to simply bow his head and accept such rigid instruction quietly. There was a quiet fire burning in his chest, a restless energy that chafed against his father's strict, volatile temperament. The house often felt too small to contain the heavy silence that stretched between them, a silence that was only ever broken by the sharp crack of wooden swords in the courtyard. To escape the heavy atmosphere of his father's expectations, the boy would often wander away from the family home, seeking refuge in the softer, more forgiving spaces of the village. He just needed to breathe. It is said he spent much of his time under the quiet care of an uncle, finding temporary shelter in rooms where the expectations were not quite so heavy. There, he could simply rest his tired muscles and let the noise of the day gently drift away into the twilight. The evening air was kind. When the heavy atmosphere of his father's house became too suffocating, the gentle retreat to his uncle's home offered a vastly different kind of education. Here, the floorboards did not echo with the sharp, demanding footsteps of a martial master, but instead creaked softly with the comfortable, unhurried movements of daily life. His uncle did not ask him to hold a heavy wooden sword, nor did he demand that the boy harden his heart against the world. Instead, he allowed the young Benusko to simply exist, to take up space, without having to apologize for his size or his quiet nature. He felt perfectly safe here. The boy would lie on the woven tatami mats, watching the dust motes drift lazily through the shafts of afternoon sunlight. The air in this house was warm, smelling faintly of dried tea leaves and old wood, wrapping around him like a heavy, comforting blanket. His breathing gradually slowed down. During those long, slow afternoons away from his father's watchful eye, Benusuke learned the deep, comforting language of solitude. He would walk along the narrow dirt paths that wove through the vibrant green rice paddies, feeling the soft, giving earth beneath his worn straw sandals. The sky above the province would stretch out in endless ribbons of pale blue and soft gray, offering a vastness that made his own complicated life feel small and manageable. He listened to the wind rustling through the stalks of rice, a gentle, shushing sound that seemed to quiet the restless noise in his own mind. He was completely at peace. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders would begin to melt away, leaving him feeling lighter, almost hollowed out by the quiet beauty of the countryside. He would sit and watch the shadows lengthen across the valley as the sun began its slow descent behind the distant peaks. The boy simply watched. As the rainy season settled over the mountains, the world outside would dissolve into a soft, gray blur of falling water. The boy would sit for hours just inside the open sliding doors, watching the heavy drops cascade from the thatched roof to splash gently into the mud below. The steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the wood became a kind of lullaby, washing away the harsh words and the bruised muscles of his daily training. He would breathe in the rich, loamy scent of the wet soil, feeling the cool, damp mist settling softly against his cheeks and his arms. The rain washed everything clean. It left the surrounding landscape feeling incredibly fresh, perfectly quiet, and deeply still as the water soaked into the waiting earth. Gradually, the rhythmic sound of the shower would slow his racing heartbeat, bringing his breath into a steady, matching cadence. He felt a profound calm. As the harsh winter slowly transitioned into a mild, forgiving spring, the boy's internal landscape seemed to thaw and quiet down alongside the natural world. He began to find a strange, solitary comfort in the very isolation that had once made him feel so profoundly out of place among the other children. While the rest of the village busied itself with the loud, communal work of planting the new rice, he would wander softly along the forest edge, his presence barely disturbing the fragile leaves. He was learning to move without making a sound, mimicking the silent, effortless glide of the shadows as the sun traveled across the sky. He belonged to the quiet. He found that if he breathed slowly enough and stepped carefully enough, he could become entirely invisible to the world around him. The forest accepted him completely, offering a sanctuary where no one expected anything from him, and where he could simply observe the gentle flow of life. The quiet belonged to him. It was in these quiet moments of observation that the boy first began to understand the hidden rhythms of the world. He did not read philosophy, and he did not study the elegant poetry of the capital, but he watched the way a hawk circled effortlessly on an invisible current of warm air. He noticed how the water in the shallow irrigation ditches would naturally find the path of least resistance, flowing smoothly around heavy stones and thick roots. He observed the precise, unchanging timing of the seasons, the way the winter frost would inevitably yield to the soft, damp warmth of spring. The boy said absolutely nothing. He was gathering an unspoken knowledge, a deep, intuitive understanding of distance, timing, and flow that would later define his entire existence. His mind was slowly becoming a quiet, still lake, perfectly reflecting the beauty and the sorrow of the world around it. The water was perfectly smooth. As he grew older, the physical awkwardness of his large frame began to settle into a quiet, dangerous grace. The villagers still kept a respectful, slightly nervous distance, sensing that the boy was holding on to a power he did not entirely understand yet. The cold floors of his childhood home and the harsh, echoing lessons of his father had forged him into something uncommonly resilient. He was no longer just a boy who took up too much space. He was a young man patiently waiting for a moment to test the heavy stillness he had cultivated inside himself. His patience was deeply ingrained, and while the distant wars of the nation raged on far away, his own first battle was slowly walking down the dusty road toward his quiet village. The cicadas hummed softly in the fading light, gently lulling the fields as the long, quiet afternoon finally surrendered to the evening. The world prepared to sleep. The quiet rhythm of the village was usually measured entirely by the gentle changing of the seasons and the soft, reliable falling of the rain. Into this perfectly insulated world came a man from the outside, carrying the sharp, rigid edges of a country that was elsewhere consumed by conflict. His name was Arima Kihei, a traveling samurai who had trained deeply in the formal, unyielding traditions of the Shinto Ryu school of swordsmanship. He arrived with a polished, demanding presence, leaving a public challenge that hung in the humid village air like an unspoken threat. The adults of the settlement whispered nervously among themselves, feeling the heavy burden of this uninvited danger settling over their quiet homes. They were farmers and simple people, possessing no desire to meet the harshness of a trained warrior and wishing only for the stranger to peacefully move on. The village grew incredibly quiet, but 13-year-old Benisoke heard the anxious whispers of the elders entirely differently. While the adults saw a terrifying threat to their peaceful routine, the boy merely observed a disturbance in the natural flow of his surroundings, much like a large stone dropped into a quiet stream. He did not feel the icy grip of fear, nor did he feel the rising, chaotic heat of pride. He simply felt a strange, inevitable gravity pulling him toward the dusty field at the edge of the village. The adults tried desperately to dissuade him, speaking softly of his youth and his complete lack of formal, polished training. They reminded him that he was only a boy, entirely unequipped to face a grown man who had spent his life mastering the art of the blade. He listened to their gentle warnings, his expression remaining perfectly still, but his decision was already made in the quietest depths of his mind. He breathed in slowly. The night before the encounter was cool and draped in a thick, comforting darkness that wrapped around the wooden houses. The boy sat alone on the edge of the veranda, much like he had done on so many restless evenings before, listening to the vast silence of the sleeping world. He held a simple wooden stick in his hands, feeling the rough bark and the natural, imperfect curve of the branch against his palms. It was not a forged weapon, nor was it perfectly balanced, but it felt right in his oversized grip, grounding him in the simple reality of the wood. He traced his thumb over the grain, listening to the soft rustling of the leaves in the surrounding forest. The distant noise of the village had faded completely, leaving only the steady, rhythmic pulse of his own heartbeat. The air was wonderfully still. He closed his eyes and let the cool night breeze wash over his face, completely untroubled by the morning that was waiting for him. When the morning finally arrived, it brought with it a soft gray light that gently filtered through the low-hanging mist. The damp earth was cool and giving beneath his bare feet as he walked slowly toward the designated field, feeling completely untethered from the anxieties of the people around him. Each step he took felt deliberate and heavy, pressing into the soft dirt and leaving a shallow, quiet imprint behind. The world around him seemed to move at a fraction of its normal speed, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. He could hear the faint, delicate sound of a single drop of dew falling from a pine needle to splash softly against a stone. He could feel the slight, waking chill of the morning air settling comfortably against his arms and his neck. He was not rushing. He allowed the morning to unfold exactly as it was meant to, stepping softly through the tall, wet grass while the village held its breath. The field at the edge of the village was usually a place of quiet, empty space. But today, it was ringed by a silent, watchful crowd. The villagers stood tightly together, their breaths creating small, soft clouds in the cool, damp air, their eyes fixed on the clearing before them. In the center of the field stood Arima Kihei, looking every bit the part of a master swordsman. His posture was rigid and perfect, shaped by countless hours of strict, formal instruction. His polished sword gleaming faintly in the overcast light. He expected to face a man of similar standing, someone who understood the precise rules of engagement and the elegant forms of combat. Instead, the tall, heavy-set 13-year-old boy stepped slowly into the clearing, holding nothing but his roughly carved wooden stick. The contrast was profoundly stark. The polished samurai and the quiet, barefoot boy stood at opposite ends of the dusty earth. For a long, stretched moment, absolutely nothing happened, as if time itself had decided to pause and simply watch. The air between them felt incredibly thick, much like the heavy atmosphere just before a summer rain finally begins to fall. Arima Kihei adjusted his stance, his breathing sharp and strictly controlled, ready to execute the precise, flowing movements he had practiced thousands of times in the dojo. The boy did not take a formal stance at all. He simply stood there, his bare feet planted firmly in the dirt, breathing in a slow, deep rhythm that mirrored the gentle swaying of the trees at the edge of the forest. High above them, a single bird circled lazily against the pale gray sky, completely detached from the tense affairs of the people below. The boy watched the bird for a brief moment. Then, he looked back at the man, letting his breath out in one long, continuous sigh that seemed to merge with the soft morning wind. The wait was softly over. The encounter itself unfolded not as a clash of formal, elegant techniques, but as a raw, inevitable release of natural energy, like a dam quietly giving way to a swollen river. As the trained samurai moved to strike, executing a beautiful and textbook maneuver that had defeated many men before, the boy simply stepped inside the rhythm of the attack. He did not defend in the way he was supposed to, nor did he block with the expected rigidity of a trained student. Instead, he moved like water finding a sudden crack in a heavy stone, rushing forward with a blunt, uncontainable force. The rigid mathematical rules of the Shinto Ryu school dissolved completely in the face of this overwhelming, instinctual surge of motion. The boy took the grown man to the ground, the wooden stick moving with the heavy, inescapable weight of a falling branch. It was over almost immediately. The carefully laid plans of the trained warrior were quietly swept away. As the brief burst of motion ceased, a profound and heavy silence fell over the dusty field, pressing down softly on the shoulders of everyone watching. The fine particles of earth that had been kicked up by their feet hung suspended in the pale morning light, drifting lazily and beautifully through the quiet air. The villagers standing at the edge of the clearing did not cheer, nor did they gasp. They simply stared in quiet, collective disbelief at the stillness before them. The grown, fully trained samurai lay defeated in the dirt, his formal training rendered entirely obsolete by the untamed gravity of a boy with a stick. There was no grand celebration, and there was no sense of glorious triumph to fill the empty, echoing space. There was only the sound of the wind returning to the tops of the trees, gently shushing the leaves as if to comfort the earth. The dust slowly settled. Bonosuke slowly lowered the wooden stick, feeling the familiar rough bark against his palm once again, his chest rising and falling in a steady, calming rhythm. The immense, heavy energy that had surged through his young frame quietly drained away into the soil beneath his feet, leaving him feeling deeply hollowed out and comfortably tired. He did not raise his arms in victory. and he did not look toward the villagers for their approval, their fear, or their praise. He simply stood there in the center of the field, letting his heartbeat gradually slow down until it matched the quiet, steady pulse of the morning around him. He was, once again, just a 13-year-old boy standing quietly barefoot in the damp dirt. He turned away from the center of the field, his bare feet padding softly against the earth as he walked toward the comforting shade of a large, ancient tree. He sat down gently. The crowd slowly dispersed, wandering back to their homes with a quiet, lingering sense of awe, leaving the boy completely and perfectly alone in the clearing. The morning gently transitioned into a warm, sleepy afternoon, casting long, soft shadows across the trampled grass and the quiet earth. Benosuke sat with his back resting against the rough bark of the tree, listening to the distant, familiar sounds of the village, settling back into its normal, unhurried routine. The memory of the brief encounter began to blur and soften in his mind, folding away into the vast, quiet expanse of the passing day. He closed his eyes, feeling the gentle warmth of the sun filtering through the leaves to rest softly against his cheek and his tired shoulders. The heavy burden of the morning had completely vanished, and the world had returned to its perfectly still, profoundly peaceful state. He rested quietly in the shade. The years that followed that quiet, dusty afternoon in the village folded into one another with the slow, inevitable rhythm of turning seasons. When the boy turned 16, the heavy silence of his childhood home finally gave way to the quiet, endless calling of the open dirt road. He packed very little, carrying only the barest of necessities and the wooden practice weapons that felt so familiar and grounding in his large, calloused hands. The historical records of this particular time in his life remained soft and pleasantly thin, leaving behind only scattered fragments of a young man walking deliberately through the mountains and valleys of a vast, complicated country. Japan was still wrestling with its own loud, chaotic conflicts in the distance, but the boy walked through the countryside like a shadow passing gently over the earth, entirely undisturbed by the noise. He walked alone. The dust of the rural roads rose in soft, gentle puffs beneath his worn straw sandals, settling quietly back onto the earth long after he had passed. This period of wandering was not a forced exile, but rather a deliberate, quiet retreat into the vastness of the natural world. For Musashi, the open road offered a profound kind of freedom that the rigid, echoing halls of his father's house never could, wrapping around him like a heavy, comforting blanket of solitude. He learned to find his rhythm in the steady, repetitive motion of putting one foot in front of the other, feeling the giving earth beneath his soles and the gentle resistance of the wind against his shoulders. The days were measured not by the demands of a master, but by the slow, beautiful arc of the sun as it traveled across the pale, open sky. He breathed in the rich, loamy scent of the forests. When the afternoon sun began to dip behind the distant peaks, he would find a quiet clearing at the edge of the woods to make his camp. The routine was always the same: road, fire, sleep. This soft, repetitive loop became the comforting architecture of his adolescent years, a predictable rhythm that soothed the restless energy he had carried since childhood. He would gather dry fallen branches, feeling the rough bark and the satisfying snap of the wood as he prepared a small, contained fire to push back the evening chill. As the golden flames slowly flickered to life, casting warm, dancing shadows against the trunks of the ancient trees, the deep silence of the forest would settle around him like a familiar friend. He would sit close to the warmth, watching the embers glow with a mesmerizing, steady heat, while the cool night air brushed softly against the back of his neck. His muscles, tired from the long day of walking, would gradually release their tension into the damp earth. He was entirely at peace. He did not travel aimlessly, though his path rarely followed the straight, predictable roads favored by merchants and messengers. Instead, he wandered from town to town, taking small jobs where he could find them, and seeking out the scattered dojos that dotted the rural provinces. He fought anyone who was willing to face him, stepping onto the polished wooden floors of various martial schools with a quiet, observant heaviness that unsettled older, more experienced men. Yet he did not fight with the loud, desperate pride of a young man trying to prove his worth to a watching world. He fought simply to understand. He would watch the formal, rigid techniques of his opponents, observing how their styles were constructed, how their weight shifted, and where the subtle, hidden weaknesses in their movements lay. He studied them quietly. Every encounter was a silent lesson, absorbed deeply into the muscles and the memory of the growing wanderer. When a match was over, regardless of the outcome, he did not stay to boast or to collect the hollow praises of the spectators who gathered to watch. He would simply bow, collect his wooden weapons, and step back out into the quiet, welcoming embrace of the open countryside, letting the noise of the dojo fade away behind him. As he walked away, he would mentally replay the movements he had just witnessed, refining his own approach and gently stripping away any technique that felt unnecessary or overly complicated. He was slowly building a unified understanding of motion, peeling back the layers of tradition to find the raw, essential truth beneath. His mind was perfectly clear. Road, fire, sleep. The seasons turned in a gentle, unbreakable circle, transforming the young boy into a deeply grounded and deliberate young man. He learned to sleep outdoors through the soft, damp rains of spring, finding shelter beneath the heavy, drooping branches of the cedar trees that kept the ground beneath them wonderfully dry. He walked through the sweltering, oppressive heat of the summer months, listening to the deafening hum of the cicadas that pulsed like a collective, living heartbeat in the tall grass. When the autumn air turned sharp and biting, he wrapped his simple cotton garments tighter around his broad shoulders, breathing out small clouds of white mist into the cooling morning light. He loved the cold. The winter brought a profound, heavy stillness to the mountains, blanketing the world in deep, silent snow that completely absorbed the sound of his passing. During these long, solitary years, the impulsive, dangerous energy that had once defined his childhood slowly gave way to a remarkable, observant stayness. He stopped simply looking at the world around him and began to truly perceive it, noticing the intricate, invisible connections that bound everything together in a quiet harmony. He watched the way a dry leaf would fall from a high branch, drifting lazily on the subtle currents of the wind before coming to rest softly on the surface of a moving stream. He observed the precise, unchanging distance between the rippling water and the smooth, gray stones that guided its path, realizing that everything in nature possessed its own perfect, unforced timing. He said absolutely nothing. This deep, quiet observation became his true martial art, a philosophy that was not yet written in heavy books, but was instead being lived breath by breath on the dusty roads of Japan. He was searching for something profound, a concept he would eventually come to call simply the way, an understanding that transcended the mere physical act of holding a weapon. He began to realize that the principles he was discovering out here in the quiet isolation of the forests were the same principles that govern the entire vast universe. The timing of a perfectly placed step was no different from the timing of the changing seasons, and the distance between two opposing forces was exactly the same as the distance between the Earth and the pale, glowing moon. He felt these connections deeply in his bones, a wordless, comforting knowledge that washed over him like a warm tide as he walked the endless dirt paths. He was not just surviving in the wilderness, he was slowly becoming a part of its deep, unbroken rhythm. As the months stretched beautifully into years, the physical act of traveling became a deeply meditative practice, smoothing out the rough, untamed edges of his soul. The heavy, calloused skin on the soles of his feet became intimately familiar with every texture of the Japanese countryside, from the sharp, unforgiving rocks of the mountain passes to the soft, yielding mud of the rice paddies. He learned to step so lightly that he barely disturbed the fragile moss growing on the ancient, weathered roots that crossed his path. His breathing naturally synchronized with the slow, steady swing of his arms and the unhurried placement of his feet, creating a calming, internal cadence that quieted the restless noise of his mind. He was perfectly grounded. Road, fire, sleep. In the evenings, as the deep blue twilight surrendered to the vast, heavy darkness of the night, he found his greatest comfort in the simple act of rest. He would lie on his back near the dying warmth of his small campfire, looking up through the canopy of leaves at the endless, glittering expanse of the stars above. The profound vastness of the night sky made his own solitary existence feel incredibly peaceful, a tiny, quiet spark in the beautiful, overwhelming machinery of the cosmos. The sounds of the nocturnal forest, like the soft hooting of a distant owl, or the gentle rustle of a small animal in the brush, were not threatening, but were instead the comforting lullabies of a world that accepted him exactly as he was. He felt entirely safe. Tonight, the air is perfectly still, wrapped in the soft gray twilight that settles over the mountains like a heavy velvet cloak. The small campfire has burned down to a pile of softly glowing crimson embers, radiating a gentle, consistent heat that wards off the creeping dampness of the deep forest. Musashi lies quietly on a bed of dry pine needles, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence that perfectly matches the quiet breathing of the sleeping world around him. The long, dusty road of the day is entirely forgotten, and the miles yet to be walked tomorrow do not matter at all in this suspended, beautiful moment of rest. The wind softly whispers through the high branches, singing a gentle ancient song that asks for absolutely nothing in return. He lets go completely. The night holds him safely, and the quiet journey gently fades into the comforting depths of a deep, untroubled sleep. The year 1600 arrives gently, though it carries the heavy, gathering clouds of a nation preparing to tear itself apart once more. The quiet wandering of the young man is temporarily paused as he is drawn into the massive, sweeping currents of history. He finds himself standing among the vast army of the Ashikaga clan, a single, quiet presence in a sea of thousands of gathered men. The fields of Sekigahara are vast and open, waiting patiently beneath a heavy gray autumn sky that seems to press softly against the tops of the mountains. Men murmur in the damp morning air, their breaths forming small clouds that drift and vanish into the creeping, cold mist. Musashi does not feel the anxious, trembling fear that grips the men standing beside him. He simply watches the fog roll over the hills. The earth beneath his feet is soft and damp, waiting quietly for the storm to break. When the conflict finally begins, it unfolds not as a glorious tale of heroism, but as a vast, chaotic storm of noise and smoke that completely obscures the pale morning light. From a distance of centuries, we do not need to look closely at the sharp edges of the violence, nor do we need to dwell on the harsh, metallic clashes that echo across the valley. We only need to see it as a heavy, dark cloud moving slowly across the landscape, a profound disruption of the natural, beautiful quiet. Musashi moves through the center of this storm with the same heavy, deliberate focus he learned in the silent forests of his youth. The world around him dissolves into a blur of motion and sound, but his breathing remains remarkably and peacefully steady. He steps through the chaos like a man walking through a heavy downpour, simply doing what is necessary to survive the overwhelming flood. He is completely present. By the time the late afternoon sun begins to sink behind the distant mountains, the great battle is softly and quietly over. The Ashikaga forces have lost terribly, and the vast open fields are now blanketed in a heavy, exhausted silence that replaces the deafening roar of the day. Thousands have fallen into a deep, permanent sleep upon the trampled grass, leaving a sorrowful stillness hanging in the humid air. Musashi stands alone at the edge of the battlefield, his clothes heavy with the dampness of the evening and the dark stains of the long, exhausting day. The ringing in his ears gradually begins to fade away, replaced by the gentle, familiar sound of the wind moving softly through the tall, unbroken grass on the hills. He breathes in slowly. The air smells heavily of ash and damp earth, a somber reminder of the fire that has just swept through the valley. He simply stands and breathes. As the evening deepens, a cool, gentle rain begins to fall from the heavy clouds, washing over the valley with a quiet, indiscriminate mercy. The water touches his face, cooling his tired skin and gently washing away the grime and the deep exhaustion of the long, chaotic hours. He lifts his head slightly, letting the soft droplets fall against his closed eyelids, feeling the profound relief of the cool water resting on his skin. The rain falls on the victors and the defeated alike, completely unconcerned with the grand human politics that brought them all to this quiet field. It simply cleanses the earth, soaking deeply into the soil and beginning the slow, inevitable process of healing the scarred landscape. Musashi lets the steady, rhythmic sound of the falling rain soothe his frayed nerves. He is wonderfully alive. The heavy burden of the day begins to wash away, flowing down into the dark soil beneath his weary feet. Eventually, the young man finds a small, abandoned shrine nestled deeply within the protective shadows of the ancient forest. The wooden roof is old and weathered, covered in a thick layer of soft green moss, but it offers a dry, quiet sanctuary from the falling rain. He sits carefully on the worn wooden steps, feeling the solid, heavy timber supporting his tired frame, while the night settles comfortably around him. The silence in this hidden place is profound, broken only by the gentle, rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves into the soft puddles below. He unties his damp sandals, letting his bare feet rest against the cool, smooth stone of the pathway, feeling completely grounded in the earth. He closes his eyes. The immense, chaotic world of warlords and armies feels incredibly far away, reduced to nothing more than a faint, impossible dream. Here in the quiet dark, there is only the steady sound of the rain. He does not stay to be captured, nor does he linger to mourn the grand, abstract loss of an army he barely knew. As the darkness fully settles over the province of Sekigahara, he turns his back on the quiet fields and begins to walk slowly toward the sheltering embrace of the distant tree line. Each step is heavy and deliberate, pressing deeply into the muddy earth, carrying the profound weight of a young man who has just witnessed the absolute fragility of life. He walks away from the noise, away from the armies, and away from the rigid structures of a society that demands such massive, senseless sacrifice. He is now a ronin. This means he is a masterless samurai, a wanderer, completely unattached to any lord, any castle, or any grand political cause. He belongs only to himself. The vast, dark forest welcomes him back with a familiar, comforting silence, wrapping around his exhausted shoulders like a thick, warm blanket. To be a ronin in this era is to be an outcast, a warrior without a purpose, or the comforting protection of a wealthy master to guide his path. For many men, this sudden loss of status is a deep, shameful tragedy, leading to a life of bitter resentment and loud, angry sorrow. But for Musashi, this untethering from the rigid expectations of society feels wonderfully light, like a heavy set of armor finally being unlaced and allowed to fall away into the dust. He wanders quietly from town to town, taking work where he can find it, completely unbothered by the fact that he is living day to day on the margins of the world. He finds a quiet, meditative joy in the simple, repetitive motions of everyday survival, sweeping courtyards or carrying wood while the seasons gently turn. He is perfectly content. He does not miss the polished halls of the warlords, for he has discovered that the open sky makes a much more beautiful and forgiving roof. The memory of the great battle slowly begins to fade, softening at the edges like a delicate watercolor painting left out in the gentle rain. The sharp, terrifying noises of the clash are replaced by the steady, comforting rhythm of his own footsteps on the familiar, endless dirt roads. When he closes his eyes at night, he no longer sees the chaotic clash of armor, but instead sees the heavy gray mist rolling peacefully over the empty hills. The profound exhaustion of the experience does not harden his heart, but rather hollows it out, creating a vast, quiet space where deeper understanding can eventually grow. He sleeps deeply during these wandering months, his body demanding the profound rest that only comes after surviving a great and terrible storm. The earth holds him securely. He learns to deeply appreciate the simple, perfect warmth of a small fire and the comforting, quiet taste of a modest meal. When the evening finally arrives on the road, he builds his small, familiar fire at the edge of the woods, watching the flames dance and sway with a mesmerizing, gentle grace. The warmth of the fire sinks deeply into his tired muscles, gradually melting away the lingering chill of the autumn air that clings to his clothes. As the embers glow with a soft, crimson light, his thoughts become loose and unspooled, drifting away into the vast, starry sky above him. He lies back against the soft, giving earth, wrapping his modest cloak tightly around his shoulders, feeling the tension drain entirely from his neck and his back. The memory of Sekigahara becomes just another quiet stone in the river of his mind, smoothed over by the constant, gentle flow of passing time. He breathes out slowly. The forest around him breathes with him, a chorus of softly rustling leaves and distant, nocturnal whispers that lull his weary mind into a state of perfect, heavy rest. He is 16 years old, and he has already survived the absolute worst of what the world can do when it loses its balance. This knowledge settles comfortably into his bones, acting not as a heavy burden, but as a deeply grounding anchor that keeps him connected to the quiet present moment. He will never again be drawn into the loud, chaotic wars of ambitious men, choosing instead the quiet, solitary path of the wandering student. The night eventually gives way to a pale dawn, leaving the rural roads perfectly damp and quiet in the early morning light. Musashi adjusts the wooden swords at his belt, feeling the familiar grounding weight of the carved wood resting softly against his hip. He takes a slow, deep breath of the cool morning air, feeling the steady, reliable beating of his own heart. He begins to walk. The quiet road stretches out endlessly before him, offering a beautiful, unbroken peace that asks for absolutely nothing in return. The aftermath of the great battle leaves Musashi fundamentally changed. Though the change is quiet and entirely internal, the title of Ronin, a masterless samurai, is often spoken with a heavy, lingering shame by the men of his era. It is a word that implies a deep loss of purpose, a severing of the comforting ties that bind a warrior to a wealthy lord and a safe, predictable castle. But as Musashi walks away from the ash and the memory of Sekigahara, he does not feel the crushing weight of exile. He feels a profound, almost weightless freedom. He chooses the open, dusty road over the polished, echoing wooden halls of the powerful clans. The vast, overarching sky becomes his only roof, and the quiet, turning seasons become his only master. He walks alone. The life of a wanderer is simple, stripped entirely of the complex, noisy politics that dictate the lives of other men. He travels from one small rural village to another, taking humble work where he can find it, completely unbothered by the heavy expectations of society. He sweeps courtyards, carries firewood, and walks softly along the narrow dirt paths that weave through the emerald rice paddies. The villagers he meets do not know the fierce, untamed history he carries quietly within him. They only see a tall, heavy-set young man with a calm, observant gaze and a gentle, deliberate way of moving. He asks for very little, finding a deep, sustaining comfort in the absolute bare necessities of life. The water from a cold mountain stream tastes incredibly sweet, and a simple bowl of rice is eaten slowly, with profound and quiet gratitude. During these long, solitary months of wandering, the physical world around him continues to offer its silent, beautiful lessons. He observes the gentle, unforced way the morning mist rises from the dark surface of a quiet pond, dissipating slowly into the warming air. He watches the old, weathered pine trees bending gracefully in the strong winter winds, surviving the harsh storms not through rigid defiance, but through soft, flexible yielding. He is gathering these quiet truths, folding them deeply into his mind like precious, carefully preserved letters. He does not rush his journey, for he has no specific destination to reach and no urgent master waiting for his return. He simply exists in the long, beautiful stretch of the present moment, moving in perfect harmony with the slow, steady rhythm of the natural world. He breathes in the cool air. When he does seek out the company of other warriors, it is never for the loud, hollow pursuit of glory, or the desperate need to prove his worth. He begins to visit the various dojos that are scattered across the provinces, stepping onto their polished wooden floors with a heavy, unmistakable presence. He faces many skilled men during these years, but the encounters are not grand, dramatic clashes of ego. To Musashi, they are merely quiet, physical conversations, a way of asking profound questions about distance, timing, and human nature. He watches how a man shifts his weight, how a rival holds his breath before a strike, and where the subtle, hidden tensions lie in a tightly gripped sword. He is studying the deep, universal patterns of conflict, reading the subtle movements of his opponents the way a scholar might read a beautifully written scroll. He watches and he learns. After each quiet encounter, regardless of the outcome, he does not linger in the dojo to collect praise or to bask in the warm glow of victory. He simply bows respectfully, gathers his few modest belongings, and steps back out into the cool, welcoming embrace of the evening air. The loud, echoing noise of the training hall quickly fades behind him, replaced by the familiar, comforting sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass. He walks away, mentally replaying the slow, fluid mechanics of the match, stripping away the rigid, unnecessary traditions to find the simple, effective truth beneath. He is slowly dismantling the complex, ornate styles of his era, searching for a deeper, more essential understanding of motion. He calls this quiet, lifelong pursuit simply the way, a profound philosophy that extends far beyond the mere act of holding a wooden sword. The road stretches out before him, as his reputation as an undefeated wanderer slowly begins to spread across the country. He withdraws even further into his own quiet, internal discipline. He realizes that the deepest, most profound lessons cannot be learned through endless physical repetition alone, but must be carefully examined in the deep, heavy silence of the night. He begins to seek out small, quiet rooms in the humble inns along the road, places where the wooden walls offer a temporary, comforting sanctuary from the vastness of the world. In these quiet spaces, long after the rest of the town has surrendered to a deep, untroubled sleep, Musashi remains awake. The air in the room is perfectly still, warmed slightly by the soft, glowing light of a single oil lamp. The shadows dance gently against the paper screens, completely undisturbed by the quiet, deliberate movements of the man sitting on the woven floor. He prepares his ink with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, grinding the hard, dark stone against the wet slate in smooth, unbroken circles. The sound is a soft, earthy scraping, a repetitive, grounding noise that perfectly matches the slow, steady beating of his own heart. The rich, dark scent of the wet ink rises into the quiet air, bringing with it a profound sense of calm and singular focus. He carefully selects a bamboo brush, feeling the smooth, familiar texture of the wood resting comfortably between his large, calloused fingers. He does not hold the brush with the rigid, forceful grip of a warrior, but rather with the soft, yielding touch of an artist. He breathes in deeply, letting the cool night air fill his lungs completely, and then he slowly, deliberately touches the wet tip of the brush to the soft, waiting paper. And still, he wrote. He traces the fluid, elegant characters across the page, capturing the fleeting, wordless insights he had gathered during his long days on the dusty road. He writes about the vast, formless nature of the void, the adaptable, flowing qualities of water, and the quiet, unyielding foundation of the earth. The soft scratching of the brush against the paper becomes a gentle, rhythmic lullaby, the only sound in a world that has otherwise fallen completely silent. He does not write to impress future generations, nor does he write to boast of his undefeated record. He writes simply to untangle the complex thoughts in his own mind, to give shape and form to the quiet, profound truths he is discovering out in the wilderness. The ink flows smoothly, leaving a beautiful, dark trail of quiet observation behind it. And still, he wrote, as the hours of the night slowly pass, the heavy, dark silence outside the window deepens, wrapping around the small room like a thick, comforting blanket. The flame of the oil lamp occasionally flickers, casting a warm golden glow over the pages that are now covered in his careful, deliberate script. The physical exhaustion of his travels is completely forgotten, replaced by a deep, sustaining energy that comes from absolute, undivided focus. He is completely present in this small, quiet moment, perfectly aligned with the gentle, rhythmic motion of his own hand. The heavy burden of his past and the unknown miles of his future completely dissolve, leaving only the soft paper, the dark ink, and the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing. The world outside the room has entirely ceased to exist. This quiet, solitary practice of writing becomes just as essential to his wandering life as the wooden swords he carries at his waist. The discipline of the brush begins to inform the discipline of his steps, teaching him that true mastery requires a softness and a sensitivity that violence can never provide. He learns to appreciate the beautiful, empty spaces between the characters on the page, realizing that the unwritten silence is just as important as the dark, heavy ink. He begins to see the entire world through this lens of balance and harmony, noticing how the soft, gentle rain eventually wears away the hardest, most unyielding stones. He is no longer just a wanderer fighting for survival. He is slowly becoming a quiet, observant philosopher, a man deeply in tune with the slow, inevitable rhythms of the universe. The night is wonderfully quiet. And still, he wrote, Sometimes he does not write words at all, but instead allows the brush to sweep across the paper in broad, simple strokes, capturing the essence of a resting bird or a single, bending reed. These paintings are not delicate or overly refined. They are raw, direct, and completely devoid of unnecessary decoration, much like the man himself. He finds a deep, wordless joy in the simple act of creation, a profound contrast to the destructive, heavy reality of the martial world he navigates during the day. The ink dries slowly on the paper, leaving behind a permanent, quiet record of a mind that is searching for perfect stillness. He sets the brush down gently on the wooden table, feeling a deep, hollowed-out sense of satisfaction settling comfortably into his chest. His work for the night is finally complete. The small oil lamp begins to burn low, its golden light softly dimming as the early hours of the morning approach. The air in the room grows slightly cooler, a gentle reminder that the long, quiet night will soon surrender to the pale light of dawn. Musashi carefully blows out the small flame, allowing the deep, heavy darkness to wash over the room and cover the wet pages of his journal. He lies down on the simple woven mat, pulling a thick cotton blanket over his tired shoulders, feeling the solid, unyielding floor, supporting his heavy frame. The gentle, rhythmic scratching of the brush is gone, replaced entirely by the slow, deep sound of his own breathing. He closes his eyes, letting the quiet peace of the solitary night carry him away. The world outside remains perfectly still, and the wandering Ronin finally, deeply rests. The dirt roads of the countryside eventually widen and harden, gently guiding the wandering Ronin toward the cultural heart of the nation. In the year 1604, Musashi walks slowly into the ancient, sprawling city of Kyoto. The capital is a place of refined elegance, filled with polished wooden architecture and the soft, quiet rustling of expensive silk. It is a city that prides itself on deep tradition and strict, unspoken rules of conduct. Here, the martial arts are not just a matter of simple survival, but are elevated to a highly respected, formalized pursuit of status. The most prestigious of these institutions is the Yoshioka School, a proud family line that had served as the personal sword instructors to the powerful shoguns for generations. They possess vast wealth, deep political connections, and an impeccable reputation that stretches back through the decades. Musashi, carrying only his carved wooden swords and the dust of the open road, possesses none of these things. He is a stranger, yet the quiet wanderer does not feel intimidated by the vast, imposing temples or the wealthy estates of the city. He views the highly structured world of the Yoshioka school simply as another heavy, rigid stone resting in the middle of a flowing river. He challenges the head of the school, Yoshioka Seijuro, to a formal encounter outside the city limits. When the appointed morning arrives, Seijuro waits with the tense, sharp expectation of a highly trained master, expecting his opponent to honor the strict, punctual traditions of a formal duel. But the morning sun continues to climb slowly into the pale sky, and Musashi does not appear. An hour passes softly, and then another. The air grows warm. This deliberate lateness is not an accident, nor is it an act of simple disrespect. It is a quiet, calculated disruption of his opponent's carefully maintained internal rhythm. When Musashi finally arrives, he carries a wooden practice sword that is unusually long, which he had calmly carved himself from a piece of spare wood. Seijuro is already deeply irritated, his perfect, rigid concentration quietly unspooling into frustration. The encounter begins, and it is over almost immediately. Musashi moves with a heavy, uncontainable force, striking Seijuro with a single decisive blow that shatters the master's defenses and effectively ends his career as a warrior. There is no grand celebration, and Musashi simply turns and walks softly away, leaving the heavy silence of defeat in his wake. The Yoshioka family, reeling from the sudden, impossible loss of their leader, immediately demands a second encounter to restore their damaged honor. This time it is the younger brother, Denshiro, who steps forward into the clearing. The result is precisely the same. The match is incredibly brief, ending with a single, quiet strike. Musashi simply bows, turns his back, and disappears once again into the soft, surrounding shadows. The city holds its breath. The proud Yoshioka school is now desperate, entirely consumed by the heavy, suffocating weight of their ruined reputation. They issue a third and final challenge, but this time the formal rules of engagement are quietly discarded in the dark. They choose a young boy, Yoshioka Matashitaro, to serve as the nominal challenger. But this is merely a carefully constructed illusion. The true plan is an ambush. Dozens of heavily armed men are instructed to hide quietly in the dense, dark woods surrounding the Ichijoji temple, waiting to overwhelm the solitary wanderer when he arrives. The air in the city grows thick with unspoken tension, a heavy, nervous energy that settles over the streets like a looming summer storm. Musashi is entirely aware of the danger waiting for him in the trees. He feels the shift in the atmosphere, reading the subtle, quiet signs of a trap the same way he reads the changing direction of the wind. He breathes in slowly. Instead of arriving late, as he had done before, he completely changes the rhythm of his approach. Long before the sun even considers rising, in the absolute deepest, quietest hour of the night, Musashi begins to walk toward the temple grounds. The city of Kyoto is perfectly still, entirely asleep beneath a heavy blanket of cool, dark air. His bare feet move silently over the damp earth, making absolutely no sound as he navigates the narrow, empty paths leading up into the forested hills. The temperature drops noticeably as he enters the dense canopy of ancient pine and cedar trees, the cold air biting gently at his cheeks and his exposed hands. A thick, pale mist clings softly to the ground, swirling lazily around the heavy roots and the weathered stone lanterns that line the pathway. The world is entirely drained of color, painted only in soft, shifting shades of gray and deep, velvet black. He stops walking. He finds a quiet, concealed space high among the damp, rough branches of a large tree, settling his heavy frame comfortably into the protective shadows. He does not move, and he does not make a sound. He simply sits in the deep, freezing dark, letting his breathing slow down until it perfectly matches the slow, rhythmic swaying of the branches in the cold wind. He waits for hours. The deep silence of the pre-dawn forest is profound and heavy, broken only by the occasional, soft sound of a single water droplet falling from a pine needle to the damp earth below. His muscles are entirely relaxed, completely free from the nervous trembling tension that usually accompanies the anticipation of violence. He feels perfectly safe in the darkness, wrapped in the comforting, indifferent embrace of the natural world. He closes his eyes and simply rests in the quiet mist. Eventually, the heavy silence is broken by the faint, muffled sound of careful footsteps approaching through the wet grass. The Yoshioka men begin to arrive, filtering slowly into the clearing surrounding the temple. Even from his quiet vantage point in the trees, Musashi can sense the rigid, anxious tension radiating from the gathered men. Their breaths form small, rapid clouds in the freezing morning air, their hands gripping their hidden weapons entirely too tightly. They arrange themselves in the shadows, waiting for the sun to rise, expecting the wandering Ronin to eventually stroll down the main path. In the center of the clearing stands the young boy, Matashitaro, surrounded by his heavily armed protectors. The sky above the canopy slowly begins to turn a pale, bruised purple, signaling the gentle, inevitable arrival of the dawn. The forest is holding its breath. Musashi waits just a moment longer, allowing the men to settle completely into their tense, rigid expectations. Then, with a quiet, terrifying grace, he drops softly from the branches and steps out of the shifting mist. He bursts from his cover before anyone can fully register his presence, moving with a fluid, overwhelming speed that entirely shatters the fragile quiet of the morning. The encounter is not a prolonged, dramatic clash of weapons, but rather a brief, necessary blur of perfectly timed motion. He cuts down the young challenger before the protectors can react, immediately disrupting the center of their carefully planned ambush. He does not linger to fight the remaining men, nor does he allow himself to be drawn into a chaotic, overwhelming struggle. Instead, he moves continuously through their broken ranks, fighting his way through the confusion and immediately disappearing back into the deep, welcoming shadows of the dense forest. It is over in a matter of seconds. The heavy mist swallows him completely. As he walks away from the temple grounds, the chaotic noise of the startled men quickly fades into the distance, completely absorbed by the thick, ancient trees. The Yoshioka school is definitively destroyed, their centuries of proud reputation dismantled entirely by a single, unattached wanderer in the quiet hours of the morning. But as Musashi continues to walk deeper into the mountains, leaving the great city of Kyoto far behind him, he does not feel a soaring sense of glorious victory. The immense, heavy reality of what he has just done settles slowly onto his broad shoulders, a somber, quiet weight that seems to pull his tired body closer to the earth. The adrenaline that had sharpened his focus begins to drain away, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion that seeps deeply into his bones. He breathes out a long, slow sigh. The cool mountain air fills his lungs, washing away the metallic, heavy scent of the morning. He walks for miles without stopping, guided only by the soft, gray light of the rising sun filtering gently through the trees. The rhythmic, repetitive sound of his own footsteps becomes a comforting, grounding mantra, slowly quieting the restless, echoing noise in his mind. With every step he takes away from the city, the heavy, complex world of human ambition and bloody revenge grows a little fainter, a little less real. He is returning to the simple, vast emptiness of the open road, seeking the profound, quiet peace that only the wilderness can provide. He traces the rough bark of a passing tree with his fingertips, grounding himself entirely in the present physical moment. He is safe now. The deep, complicated sorrows of Kyoto no longer belong to him. When the late afternoon finally arrives, bringing with it a soft, golden light that warms the damp forest floor, he finds a small, sheltered clearing near a gently flowing stream. The water moves continuously over the smooth gray stones, creating a soft, rhythmic burbling sound that feels incredibly soothing to his tired mind. He unlaces his worn straw sandals and steps slowly into the shallow water, letting the freezing, pristine current wash over his bruised and weary feet. The sharp cold is entirely clarifying, gently pulling the last remnants of the morning's heavy tension down into the moving stream. He stands there for a long time, watching the water flow endlessly past his ankles, completely unconcerned with the past and entirely unbothered by the future. The forest is completely still around him. He simply breathes. He builds his small, familiar fire as the twilight slowly begins to gather in the spaces between the trees. The dancing, crimson flames cast a warm, soft glow against his exhausted face, offering a simple, deeply comforting heat as the evening air grows cold. He wraps his heavy cotton cloak tightly around his shoulders, sitting cross-legged on the soft, giving moss, completely surrendering to the profound weariness that blankets his body. The memories of the Yoshioka school, the polished wooden floors, and the tense, mist-filled ambush begin to blur softly at the edges, slowly dissolving into the vast, quiet space of his mind. He lies back against the cool earth, looking up at the first pale stars appearing in the deep indigo sky. The rhythmic sound of the nearby stream becomes a gentle, ancient lullaby. He closes his eyes. The heavy burden of the long day is finally lifted, and the solitary wanderer drifts quietly into a deep, untroubled sleep. The long years of solitary wandering eventually guide the young Ronin toward the very edge of the country, where the familiar dirt roads gently surrender to the vast gray expanse of the open sea. By the time the year 1612 arrives, Musashi's name has traveled like a quiet breeze across the scattered provinces, whispered softly in the polished halls of wealthy lords and the dusty courtyards of rural training grounds. It eventually reaches the ears of a man named Sasaki Kojiro, a highly refined and deeply celebrated warrior who is widely considered by many to be the greatest swordsman in the entire nation. Kojiro is everything that the wandering, unattached Ronin is not. He is elegant, perfectly poised, and a strict master of a highly formalized school of combat, carrying himself with a heavy, unyielding pride. He is famous for a signature technique known as the Swallow's Reversal, and he carries a beautiful, unusually long sword called an adachi, which gives him a terrifying, almost insurmountable reach. Seeking to prove the absolute superiority of his polished style, Kojiro sends a formal challenge to the wanderer, expecting to meet a man who respects the rigid, ancient traditions of their shared profession. Musashi accepts the invitation immediately, without hesitation or concern, and the profound encounters formally set for the 13th of April. The chosen location is a small, completely isolated patch of land called Ganryu, resting quietly in the deep, cold waters of the strait between Honju and Kyushu. The ocean breathes slowly. When the appointed morning finally arrives, the sky over the strait is painted in soft, bruised shades of violet and pale, silvery gray, promising a quiet and beautiful day. Sasaki Kojiro arrives on the island beach very early, moving with sharp, purposeful strides, accompanied by his loyal students and the formal officials who have come to bear quiet witness to the event. The morning air is incredibly cold and heavy, with the rich scent of salt wrapping around the gathered men like a damp, clinging blanket. The sun begins its slow, inevitable climb over the distant horizon, casting long, stretching shadows across the pristine, untouched sand of the shoreline. The appointed time gently arrives, and the appointed time just as gently passes, but the vast expanse of the water remains entirely and perfectly empty. Kojiro begins to pace back and forth along the edge of the receding tide, his rigid, disciplined patience slowly unspooling into a tight, incredibly uncomfortable anger. The rhythmic, endless crashing of the waves against the shore offers absolutely no comfort to his tense, waiting mind, standing in stark contrast to his own growing frustration. He breathes sharply and heavily. An entire hour passes softly, and then another hour drifts quietly away, while the small white gulls circle lazily in the pale morning sky. The island simply waits, completely indifferent to the tense, heavy expectations of the men standing rigidly upon its shores. The sand remains beautifully undisturbed. Far across the water, resting in his quiet quarters, Musashi is not rushing to meet the rigid, formal demands of the morning, having deliberately chosen to oversleep. This is not an act of simple laziness, but a quiet, deeply calculated disruption, a way of breaking his opponent's carefully maintained internal rhythm before they even meet face to face. When he finally steps into a small, weathered wooden boat to be rowed across the channel, the morning has already grown warm and comfortably bright. He sits quietly in the center of the gently rocking vessel, feeling the deep, slow rhythm of the ocean lifting and dropping the wooden hull in a soothing, endless lullaby. The water slaps softly against the sides of the boat, a comforting, repetitive sound that perfectly matches the slow, steady beating of his own resting heart. He looks down at the bottom of the boat and notices a spare wooden oar lying unused against the damp, sea-soaked floorboards. He picks it up gently, feeling the heavy, dense weight of the ancient wood resting solidly in his large, calloused hands. He draws his small knife. As the boat glides smoothly over the glassy surface of the water, he begins to slowly carve the oar, stripping away the thick wood in long, satisfying ribbons. The fresh shavings fall gently to the floor, smelling wonderfully of aged cedar and the deep, briny ocean, while the makeshift wooden sword gradually takes its intended shape. He crafts it specifically to be longer than a normal blade, ensuring it will reach just slightly further than Kojiro's famous extended weapon. Musashi works with a slow, meditative focus, letting the gentle rocking of the sea and the repetitive motion of his hands quiet his mind completely. He is perfectly at peace. By the time the small wooden boat finally scrapes softly against the shallow sand of Ganryu, it is already approaching the late hours of the morning. The water gently laps against the shoreline, swirling quietly around the smooth gray stones and gently pulling the loose sand back into the deep ocean. Musashi steps slowly out of the boat, his bare feet sinking comfortably into the wet, giving earth the cool, pristine ocean water dripping slowly from the hem of his simple garments. Standing on the beach, Kojiro is completely consumed by his own fury, his carefully maintained composure shattered entirely by the long, agonizing hours of waiting under the rising sun. He draws his beautiful, polished longsword with a sharp, metallic ringing sound that cuts harshly through the peaceful, rhythmic noise of the crashing ocean. In a sudden burst of pure, unfiltered frustration, he throws his protective scabbard down into the wet sand, abandoning the formal grace that usually defines his strict technique. Musashi does not raise his heavy, newly carved wooden oar immediately, nor does he mirror the intense, volatile anger of his waiting opponent. He simply smiles gently, his voice carrying softly over the rhythm of the waves as he points out the profound, fatal error in Kojiro's rigid mindset. He tells him that a man who throws away his scabbard has already lost, for he has completely abandoned the quiet, necessary intention of continuing his life. The ocean breathes in and out. The heavy tension on the beach reaches its absolute, silent peak, suspended delicately in the warm, salty air. The brief moment of the encounter does not unfold in real time, but rather slows down into a vast, suspended expanse of pure, uninterrupted observation. As Kojiro rushes forward across the sand, executing his legendary lightning-fast strike with absolute precision, the world around Musashi becomes perfectly, beautifully still. He does not consciously think about his defense, and he does not mentally plan his counterattack, because his mind has completely entered a state of profound, weightless emptiness. This is the deep, wordless space he will later call the void, a place where 10,000 hours of quiet, solitary practice have completely dissolved the heavy barrier between thought and action. The wind seems to stop entirely, and the crashing waves hang motionless in the air, leaving only the slow, inevitable geometry of the two men moving quietly across the sand. The endless repetitions of his past, the countless cold mornings in the forest, and the deep, silent observations of nature all compress themselves into this single, beautiful instance of time. Musashi steps gently into the exact space that Kojiro has left open, his body moving completely on its own, guided by a deep, unconscious understanding of distance, rhythm, and perfect timing. His nervous system remembers what his conscious mind has completely let go of, allowing him to flow seamlessly into the opening like water finding a crack in a heavy stone. The carved wooden oar comes down with a heavy, unstoppable grace, its extra length allowing it to find its mark just a fraction of a second before Kojiro's shining steel can connect. The strike is perfectly placed, carrying the immense grounded weight of the earth itself, and it is over in a single, quiet heartbeat. The legendary swordsman falls softly to the damp sand, returning to the profound, unbroken stillness of the isolated island. There's no cheering, no glorious celebration, and no triumphant roar to disrupt the vast, overarching peace of the gray ocean. The gathered officials and students stand completely frozen in shock, their eyes wide as they struggle to comprehend the sudden, absolute end of the greatest duel in their long, proud history. The victory should have been the crowning achievement of his entire life, the moment that secured his legacy forever, but instead, it merely feels like a quiet, necessary conclusion. Musashi does not linger to look down at his defeated opponent, nor does he stay to claim the hollow, echoing praises of the men standing frozen on the beach. He simply turns around, his bare feet padding softly against the wet sand, and walks calmly back toward the small, waiting wooden boat. He climbs inside, taking up the remaining oar, and begins to slowly row himself back out into the endless, beautiful expanse of the deep water. His muscles, briefly tense for the encounter, slowly release their stored energy, sinking deeply into the rhythmic, repetitive motion of rowing. As the island gently recedes into the distance, the chaotic, heavy noise of the human world completely fades away, replaced once again by the rhythmic, comforting sound of the vast ocean. He lets his breath out in a long, continuous sigh, feeling the heavy tension of the long morning washing away into the deep, invisible currents beneath his wooden boat. The gulls return to their lazy, perfect circles in the pale sky, completely unbothered by the fleeting, complicated affairs of the men below. The waves continue to roll softly against the empty, sandy shore, endlessly repeating their ancient, flawless rhythm. The world is perfectly calm. He closes his eyes, letting the gentle rocking of the boat carry him safely toward the distant, hazy shoreline, completely at peace with the quiet vastness of the sea. The water simply flows. The quiet rhythm of the ocean slowly fades into the distance, leaving behind the shores of Ganryu Island and the heavy weight of a youth spent in conflict. Musashi is 30 years old, and he has just survived the most celebrated encounter of his life. The world expects him to build a grand school, to accept the wealthy invitations of powerful lords, and to bask in the loud, echoing glory of his undisputed reputation. But the wandering Ronin simply turns his back on the noise, choosing to walk softly away from the fame that so many other men spend their entire lives desperately chasing. The violent path has taught him absolutely everything it possibly can, and the sharp edge of survival has gently dulled into a deep, profound understanding of the world. He breathes in the warm air. The wooden sword has served its quiet purpose, and now he begins to look for something else. A few years pass gently, and the era of the wandering warrior slowly begins to close around him. The country is finally settling into a long, unbroken peace, and the loud, chaotic battles of his youth are gradually becoming distant, fading memories. Around his 31st year, an invisible, beautiful shift occurs within his mind, and Musashi simply stops fighting duels altogether. The decision is not announced with grand speeches, nor is it accompanied by a heavy sense of regret. It is just a quiet setting down of a heavy burden, much like a traveler finally taking off a worn, heavy pack at the end of a long journey. He has seen the massive, mechanical violence of large battles, witnessing the tragic, senseless loss of life at places like Osaka Castle, and he realizes that the solitary path of combat must eventually evolve. He lets out a long, slow breath. The era of the sword is softly ending. As the heavy wooden practice swords are gradually laid aside, his large, calloused hands begin to seek out different, much softer tools. The intense, unbroken focus that once allowed him to read the subtle movements of an opponent is now turned completely inward, gently poured into the delicate, yielding fibers of a bamboo brush. The transition from the blade to the ink is wonderfully natural, a seamless flowing of energy from destruction into quiet creation. He discovers that the very same discipline that guided his steps in the freezing forests now allows him to control the soft, weeping bristles of a calligraphy brush with perfect, effortless grace. He grinds the dark ink against the cool stone, listening to the soft, earthy scraping sound that perfectly matches the slow, steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. He does not paint with the ornate, delicate refinement that the wealthy courts of the capital prefer, for he possesses absolutely no interest in mere decoration. His paintings are beautifully raw and entirely direct, capturing the absolute essence of a subject in just a handful of quick, decisive movements. He paints a small, resting bird with 3 simple strokes, leaving the rest of the pale, soft paper completely empty. He understands that the vast, untouched white space is just as important as the dark ink, much like the profound silence that exists just before a necessary word is spoken. The wet ink sinks slowly into the porous paper, spreading slightly at the edges before drying into a permanent, quiet memory of the present moment. He watches the ink dry. His mind is perfectly still, entirely captivated by the simple, beautiful contrast of black and white. The late afternoon sun filters gently through the sliding paper doors, casting warm, golden rectangles of light across the woven floor mats. Musashi sits comfortably in the quiet room, his heavy shoulders completely relaxed, holding the small bamboo brush with a gentle, loving grip. He breathes in slowly, drawing the cool, fragrant air deep into his chest, and as he breathes out, the brush glides softly across the page. Brushstroke, breath. The motion is incredibly soothing, a repetitive, moving meditation that continuously anchors him in the peaceful, quiet present. He dips the brush back into the dark ink, feeling the smooth, cool stone against the wood, and returns to the paper. Brushstroke, breath. The world outside the room completely ceases to exist, leaving only the soft scratching of the brush and the steady, comforting rhythm of his own lungs. Brushstroke, breath. He is perfectly at peace. When his eyes grow tired from the close, careful work of calligraphy, he steps softly out into the small, enclosed courtyard of his home. Here, the profound discipline of his mind is translated into the physical, grounded arrangement of the natural world. He begins to study the quiet, slow lives of garden stones, watching how the moss grows gradually over their rough, weathered surfaces over the passing months. He arranges the heavy rocks and the carefully raked white sand to quietly mimic the vast rolling ocean and the distant, silent mountains. The physical labor of moving the stones is deeply satisfying, completely draining the restless energy from his large frame and leaving his muscles comfortably tired. He smooths the sand with a wooden rake, creating perfect, unbroken lines that flow gently around the heavy stones like quiet water. The garden asks for absolutely nothing but his peaceful attention. During these long, peaceful years, The philosophy that he had carried wordlessly across the dusty roads of Japan finally begins to take a clear, communicable shape. He calls his school of thought Niten Ichiru, which translates softly to two heavens as one, a beautiful philosophy built entirely on the deep unity of opposites. It is not merely a system of using two swords, but a profound understanding that the harshness of combat and the softness of art are essentially the exact same thing. The discipline that allows a man to survive a terrible storm is the same discipline that allows him to write a perfect, balanced poem. He realizes that mastery is not a rigid destination to be reached, but a gentle, flowing practice that slowly touches every single aspect of a person's life. He smiles quietly to himself. The realization washes over him like a warm, comforting wave, relaxing the very deepest layers of his mind. He occasionally takes on a small number of dedicated students, but he does not teach them the rigid, formal patterns of the traditional martial schools. Instead, he takes them on long, quiet walks through the shaded forests, asking them profound, simple questions about the nature of the world and their own internal motivations. He teaches them to observe the gentle way a conversation flows, to notice the subtle, shifting patterns of the changing weather, and to feel the underlying rhythm of all living things. He wants them to understand how to think, how to perceive the vast, beautiful connections that bind the universe together in a state of constant, flowing harmony. The harsh, echoing shouts of the training hall are entirely replaced by the soft, thoughtful murmurs of men walking slowly beneath the ancient, towering trees. He listens to the wind. The teaching is as gentle as the falling autumn leaves. As he enters his late 50s, the long, solitary decades of wandering are finally and gently brought to a close. In the year 1640, a cultured and thoughtful leader named Lord Hosokawa Tadatoshi invites the aging philosopher to come and live within the quiet, protected grounds of Kumamoto Castle. This is not a strict employment, nor is it a return to the rigid, demanding world of the samurai class that he'd abandoned so long ago. The Lord simply gives him a small, comfortable house, a modest stipend, and the absolute freedom to do entirely as he pleases. For a man who has spent his entire life in constant, heavy motion, the gift of true, uninterrupted stillness is incredibly profound. He has the time to simply stand still, to watch the seasons change from the same window, and to finally make sense of the vast, complicated tapestry of his life. The house is wonderfully quiet. In the quiet comfort of his new home, he also turns his attention to the delicate, precise art of crafting metal sword guards, known as suba. He takes small, heavy pieces of iron and carefully carves them into simple, beautiful shapes, letting the raw metal yield softly to his patient hands. The work requires an incredible, unbroken patience, as the tough material must be slowly and gently persuaded to adopt the artist's vision. The soft, rhythmic tapping of his small tools against the iron creates a comforting, musical cadence that drifts lazily through the open windows of his home. He is taking the very instrument of violence and transforming it into a quiet, profound object of contemplation and art. The heavy iron grows warm in his hands, absorbing the steady, patient energy of his touch. He sets his tools down gently. The transition that Musashi experiences during these years perfectly mirrors the slow, gentle setting down of your own long day. The sharp, demanding edges of the world are gradually softened, and the loud, chaotic noises of the morning are slowly replaced by the comforting, heavy silence of the evening. Just as the old warrior lays down his wooden swords and picks up the yielding bamboo brush, the mind learns to let go of its rigid defenses and completely surrender to the quiet necessity of rest. The fierce, burning energy of youth slowly cools into a warm, sustaining ember, providing a gentle heat that thoroughly comforts the tired body. You do not need to fight the approaching darkness, nor do you need to brace yourself against the heavy, descending curtain of the night. You simply allow it to wash over you. The heavy armor is finally unlaced, and the weary traveler is allowed to lay his head down upon the soft, welcoming earth. The evening shadows begin to lengthen across the carefully raked sand of his small garden, signaling the gentle, inevitable arrival of the night. Musashi washes his ink brushes in a small ceramic bowl of cold water, watching the dark clouds of ink swirl and slowly dissipate into the clear liquid. He dries the brushes carefully with a soft cotton cloth, laying them perfectly straight upon the wooden table to rest until the morning. The work of the day is completely finished, and there are absolutely no lingering thoughts of strategy or survival to trouble his deeply settled mind. He walks slowly out to the wooden veranda, feeling the cool night air brushing softly against his aging, heavy shoulders. He sits down quietly, crossing his legs, and simply listens to the familiar, comforting sound of the wind rustling through the dark pine trees. He closes his eyes. The world is entirely peaceful, and the long, beautiful evening slowly wraps him in a deep, untroubled embrace. The quiet, comfortable life within the protected grounds of the castle is deeply peaceful. Yet the old warrior eventually feels a familiar, gentle pull toward the wilderness. Around the year 1643, as he approaches his 60th year, Musashi quietly leaves the warm wooden house provided by his generous lord. He does not travel far, taking only a short, slow walk into the heavily forested mountains, arriving at a place called Reigando. It is a simple, natural cave, carved deeply into the heavy, ancient stone of the earth. The people in the city whisper softly that he has finally lost his mind, trading a warm, secure bed for the damp, unforgiving rock of the wilderness. But they do not understand the profound comfort he finds in the wild. He is not punishing his aging body. He is simply returning to the deep, quiet isolation that has always felt like his truest home. The cave is perfectly still. The space inside the rocky enclosure is beautifully simple, barely large enough for a man to lie down, offering absolutely no unnecessary decoration. The stone walls are rough and perpetually cool to the touch, weeping softly with the deep, hidden moisture of the breathing mountain. In the winter, the air grows biting and sharp, and in the heat of the summer, it becomes incredibly heavy and warm. Musashi accepts the changing seasons exactly as they are, without a single complaint and without wishing for anything to be different. He sits cross-legged on a simple woven mat, wrapping a heavy cotton blanket tightly around his tired shoulders. He breathes in the rich, earthy scent of damp moss, wet soil, and old, resting stone. The world outside the cave continues its loud, busy turning, but here in the shadows, time seems to completely stop. He is wonderfully alone. He has come to this quiet, sheltered place to perform one final, monumental task before his long journey softly ends. He knows, with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who has lived incredibly close to nature, that his physical body is finally beginning to fail. The deep, massive well of energy that carried him safely through 60 encounters is slowly, gently drying up. If he does not write down the profound, wordless principles he has discovered over 5 decades of wandering, they will simply vanish into the earth alongside him. So, he prepares his ink in the dim, gray light that filters softly through the cave entrance. The stone basin feels wonderfully cool beneath his rough fingertips. The soft, rhythmic scraping of the dark ink stick against the wet slate becomes his daily, grounding meditation. He grinds the ink very slowly, translating the deep, intuitive knowledge of the physical body into the rigid, limiting structure of written language is incredibly difficult. How do you accurately describe the exact feeling of perfect timing, or the sudden, weightless intuition that gently tells you when to move? He struggles with the words at first, his bamboo brush hovering hesitantly over the pale, waiting paper. He writes a few careful passages, reads them in the quiet dark, and then gently burns them in his small cooking fire, watching the gray smoke drift lazily out into the forest. He is searching for the absolute, raw essence of his experience, stripping away the flowery, unnecessary language of the capital's wealthy scholars. He wants his written words to be as direct, simple, and unyielding as a carved wooden sword. He breathes out a long sigh. The cool air fills his tired lungs. Eventually, the ink begins to flow smoothly, taking the shape of a profound text that he will call the Book of 5 Rings. He organizes his vast lifetime of gathered knowledge into 5 distinct natural elements, mirroring the beautiful world outside his cave. He writes first of the ground, the solid, unshakable foundation of practical knowledge that must exist before anything else can safely grow. He writes of water, the beautiful, fluid ability to adapt and change shape to fit any container without ever losing your true, essential nature. The brush moves with a slow, deliberate, and hypnotic grace across the page. He writes of fire, the intense, decisive moment of action, and he writes of wind, the the deep understanding of the surrounding world. The cave safely holds his quiet thoughts. He rests his hand. As the long, gray days gently transition into deep, endless nights, the cave is illuminated by the soft, warm glow of a single small fire. The dancing, crimson light casts long, shifting shadows against the rough stone walls, creating a quiet, private universe where only the writer and his words truly exist. The mountain outside is wrapped in a heavy velvet darkness, entirely silent except for the occasional, distant call of a nocturnal bird drifting through the trees. Musashi sits close to the comforting heat of the flames, feeling the gentle warmth sinking deeply into his tired, aching joints. The loud, physical world of his youth is slowly fading away into the distance, but his mind remains incredibly clear, perfectly sharp, and completely at peace. He dips the brush slowly into the dark ink. He touches it softly to the paper. He is entirely and perfectly at peace with the profound solitude of the mountain. He does not feel lonely in the vast dark, for he has spent his entire life learning to be completely comfortable within his own quiet, steady company. The cave is not a cold prison. It is a warm sanctuary, a place where the loud, demanding expectations of society can no longer reach him. He finds a deep, sustaining comfort in the absolute, stripped-down simplicity of his daily existence. He eats only what his body requires, sleeps gently whenever his eyes grow heavy, and spends the rest of his quiet hours simply observing the slow unfolding of his own mind. The heavy burden of his legendary reputation is completely gone, washed away by the mountain rain. He is no longer the greatest warrior in Japan. He is simply an old man, resting quietly in the dark. The slow, deliberate pacing of his life in the cave beautifully mirrors the gentle, inevitable slowing down of his own physical body. He no longer moves with the sudden, explosive energy of his wandering youth, but instead moves with a heavy, mindful grace, considering every single breath before he takes it. When he finally lays down to sleep on his thin, woven mat, he feels the solid, uncompromising support of the entire mountain resting beneath him. The stone does not yield, and it does not offer soft, false comfort, but it holds him incredibly securely against the earth. He listens to the sound of his own breathing, a slow, rhythmic tide that ebbs and flows perfectly in the vast silence of the cavern. Inhale, deeply and slowly. Exhale, completely and softly. The night air is cool and incredibly pure. He closes his tired eyes, completely surrendering to the profound, heavy stillness of the ancient mountain. The winter snows outside the Rigando cave slowly melt away, replaced by the soft, damp green of the early Japanese summer. The year is 1645, and Musashi is 62 years old. He can feel the deep, fundamental machinery of his body beginning to slow down, gently unwinding like a heavy spool of thread that has finally run its course. The transition is not frightening to him, nor is it painful. It is simply a natural, inevitable yielding to the quiet pull of the earth. He does not fight it. He accepts this final phase with the exact same quiet, observant calm that he used to face the vast, open ocean and the dense, freezing forests of his youth. The heavy, physical energy that sustained him through 5 decades of constant wandering is gracefully departing, leaving behind a profound, almost weightless sense of clarity. He breathes softly. The air in the cave is cool, smelling faintly of wet pine and ancient stone. On a quiet day in the 5th month of the year, he completes the very last pages of his great written work. He finishes the Book of the Void, setting down his final, quiet thoughts on the absolute emptiness that exists beneath all things. He carefully wraps the delicate manuscript, tying it securely, and gently hands it over to his trusted student, Tera Magonojo. The physical weight of the knowledge is no longer his to carry. He watches the young man walk away down the narrow mountain path, carrying a lifetime of solitary observation wrapped softly in simple cloth. Musashi does not watch him disappear completely into the trees. He simply turns back to the comforting shadows of the cave, feeling a deep, sustaining sense of completion. The great burden of his life's work has been safely set down. His calloused hands are finally empty. Yet, in the quiet days that follow, there is one last, brief task to perform. He prepares his ink for the very last time, the familiar, earthy scent rising softly into the cool air. He takes up his brush to write the dokodo, the way of walking alone. These are not heavy, complicated instructions for other men to follow, but rather a simple, honest accounting of his own quiet heart. He writes 21 short precepts, distilling his entire existence down to its absolute, unadorned essence. Accept everything just the way it is, he writes, his hand moving slowly and deliberately across the soft paper. He writes about letting go of desire, about leaving behind regret, and about finding perfect peace in the simple, present moment. The brushstrokes are beautifully raw and perfectly direct, carrying no unnecessary decoration. He sets the brush down. He strips away everything that is no longer needed. By the time the second week of June arrives, his worldly possessions have been reduced to almost nothing. He keeps only his 2 wooden swords, a few basic supplies for his daily survival, and the quiet, comforting space of his own mind. For a man who could have lived in the polished, wealthy halls of a great castle, this absolute simplicity is not a hardship. It is a profound and beautiful freedom. He has gently untethered himself from the heavy, complicated demands of the world. There are no grand estates to manage, no vast fortunes to distribute, and no anxious, lingering regrets to trouble his weary mind. He is traveling incredibly light. The cave offers him the perfect, unyielding embrace of the ancient mountain, holding him securely against the earth. The days grow slightly warmer outside, but the interior of the stone cavern remains wonderfully cool and perfectly still. The light that filters through the entrance is soft and gray, casting gentle, elongated shadows that barely move across the rough walls. Musashi sits quietly on his woven mat, wrapped in his heavy cotton blanket, completely surrendering to the slow, heavy rhythm of the passing hours. The loud, chaotic noise of the human world, the echoing shouts of the training halls, the chaotic roar of the battlefields, the bustling markets of the capital has entirely faded away. It is all gone, washed away by the vast, quiet ocean of passing time. There is only the sound of the wind moving softly through the high branches, and the occasional gentle drip of water falling from the ceiling to the damp stone floor. He closes his eyes. A soft rain begins to fall outside the cave, sweeping gently across the forested slopes of the mountain. The sound is a steady, rhythmic drumming against the leaves, washing the world clean and bringing a deep, soothing moisture to the air. Musashi listens to the rain, feeling the cool mist drifting softly into the entrance of his sanctuary, settling comfortably against his cheeks and his tired shoulders. He does not need to move, and he does not need to brace himself against the weather. He is perfectly sheltered, completely safe within the heavy, protective stone of the earth. The rhythmic sound of the falling water naturally begins to slow his own breathing, drawing his inhales and exhales into a steady, matching cadence. Inhale the cool, damp mist. Exhale the heavy weariness of the decades. The rain sings a quiet, ancient lullaby. He does not spend these final days wishing for more time, nor does he dwell on the distant, fading memories of his youth. He has lived his life exactly as he intended to, completely on his own terms, and he has extracted every possible ounce of meaning from his long, solitary journey. There is no fear of the approaching darkness, for he has spent his entire life intimately acquainted with the vast, quiet spaces between breaths. The fading of his physical strength simply mirrors the gentle dimming of the evening light. He lies back upon the firm, supportive earth, feeling the deep, ancient heartbeat of the mountain beneath him. His own heartbeat begins to slow down, matching the profound, unbroken rhythm of the natural world. He breathes in the cool air and lets it out in a long, continuous, peaceful sigh. The transition from life to rest is not a sudden, dramatic event, but rather a slow, beautiful fading, much like a dark ink wash slowly drying on pale paper. The boundaries between his quiet mind and the surrounding world begin to soften and gently blur. He feels the dampness of the stone, the coolness of the air, and the vast, starry sky above the mountain as completely natural extensions of himself. He is slowly dissolving back into the elements he wrote about so carefully: the grounding earth, the adaptable water, the warming fire, and the moving wind. He is finally, truly entering the void. The heavy armor of his identity, the legendary swordsman, the wandering ronin, the quiet philosopher, is gently unlaced and allowed to fall away completely. He is just a man, resting deeply in the quiet dark. The world will eventually tell loud, grand stories about his undefeated record, his brilliant strategies, and his unyielding discipline. They will study his quiet writings in wealthy boardrooms and crowded classrooms for centuries to come. But here, in the quiet, dim light of the cave, none of those distant echoes matter at all. The true beauty of his life is not found in the countless men he defeated or the heavy books he wrote, but in this absolute, perfect capacity to finally be still. He has spent 62 years in constant, deliberate motion, and now he is allowing himself to completely stop. The profound exhaustion of his long journey is melting away, replaced by a deep, sustaining comfort that settles warmly into his bones. The work is entirely finished. The long day is softly over. As the night deepens over the mountain, the forest falls completely and perfectly silent. The birds have tucked their heads beneath their wings, and the small animals have sought safe shelter in the deep, warm brush. The entire world has surrendered to the heavy, comforting blanket of sleep. Inside the small stone sanctuary, the soft crimson embers of the small fire begin to gently lose their heat, casting a final warm glow against the weathered walls. The silence in the room is profound, rich, and beautifully complete. It is the silence of a mind that requires absolutely nothing more from the world, and a world that requires absolutely nothing more from the mind. The air is wonderfully still. The shadows lengthen and merge, wrapping the old wanderer in a deep, untroubled embrace. The physical world slowly drifts away, leaving only the soft, steady rhythm of the present moment. The mountain breathes. The forest rests. The candle dims, the brush rests, and somewhere the breath finally slows all the way down.